All right. Camera's a little close. Guess it's all right. Got a couple things. Three main points I want to make about this final episode of the stellar first season of Twin Peaks. Um, 7 episodes. It never gets better. It's still good, although the first episodes of season 2 I just do not like. And not because of the waiter scene that people seem to hate so much. It's all the hospital stuff. Anything on television that has to do with hospitals bores me to tears. Friends has a bunch of episodes in hospitals. I was just like anything like a wedding, a funeral, or a birth. I'm just like, they're almost unbearable in real life. I certainly don't want to see them on a drama series. That said, the hospital scenes in season 1 though of Twin Peaks are really good because they don't have much to do with the functioning of a hospital. Okay, so three main points I want to make about this finale, and one of them is very small, and it has to do with the fact that this episode has an element that was inspired by Blue Velvet. There's a scene in Blue Velvet where Dennis Hopper's character, Frank Booth, drives Jeffrey Beaumont, with him and his crew, drives Jeffrey Beaumont out into the middle of nowhere. And this is going to have to come off, it's too hot. And on the way there, he says, "Do you like to walk?" And he doesn't know what he's talking about. He beats him up, and then he has to walk all the way back home. He's out on Meadow Lane. Apparently, Meadow Lane's really far away. Jacques Renault mentions while he's in the hospital bed that Leland beat him up and took off, and he said, "I had to walk 15 miles." So there's some, I don't know if David Lynch experienced this or heard about this, but he has some kind of interest in the idea of you being beat up and having to walk. I'm sure it's related to Philadelphia somehow. I have to keep my voice down. Everybody's asleep right now. I apologize for that. Um, the next element that's really interesting is, and I need to be careful. I can't go into my interpretive theories here, but if you're interested in how I think interpretations ought to be done, look at my part 1 video on Memento, an analysis of Memento. Basically, I talk about some of they're just hermeneutical rules that most people don't follow, and as a result, their interpretations go off the reservation. They're anywhere and everywhere, and you end up going, "But wait a minute, this doesn't fit this, and this doesn't fit that," and you end up with really meaningless nonsense rather than things that actually make sense. So I am following some rules of interpretation, but I am going to kind of break one here. And the reason why I'm breaking it doesn't break it because I'm telling you about it. I don't like to read into symbolism that may not be there just because it sounds creative. You want to be creative when you're interpreting, but not so creative that you're just making up your own stuff. Now, Lynch has made it clear that he wants people to do this, but I try to limit that as much as I can. If you're interested in that kind of thing, there's tons of material out there. Most of it I get bored with very quickly because it's just them riffing off of what you see. I'm more curious about the intention behind the series. But there is something here that's really interesting, and that is, and let me explain this because you may not get it. I don't believe the idea for Bob, from what I've read, being an inhabiting host arrived to the writers' minds until the second season. But it's possible that the idea of Bob being an inhabiting host appeared before then. Now, I wouldn't blame you for going, "How's that possible?" Before you disbelieve what I'm saying about the creative process, you really should read what people say about the creative process. In one of my earliest videos about mathematics and God, I talk about this, and I mentioned Stephen King and David Lynch. And one of the things during the creative process is Stephen King says he feels more like an archaeologist. He feels like he finds what's there. David Lynch said he feels like your mind is a net and you put it into a place where the ideas are and it retracts the ideas. And that means there's a process to this, okay? It's processional. We can't fully explain it. We're not sure how this works. I think part of the process about figuring out who Bob is here in this episode. And it's really interesting. So when he says, through the darkness of the future's past, the magician longs to see one chance out between two worlds, fire walk with me. The idea here is that that poem may be about Bob, okay? That may be Bob, and what Bob is doing and what Laura is trying to stop is firewalking, okay? Leland in season 2 explains to the sheriff, he says, this next door neighbor, who is Bob, used to flick matches at him and say, do you want to play with fire, little boy? Laura said that to James. Do you want to play with fire? As if Bob was saying that through her father to her. So it could be that process is called firewalking. All right, this is where it gets interesting. So when Shelley is in the sawmill's on fire. It shows Catherine save Shelley from the sawmill, and the sawmill's on fire, and then it cuts to something. What does it cut to? It cuts to someone setting off the fire alarm in the hospital. And then the next thing you know, you see Jacques Renault being smothered, and we look up and we see Leland. And that could be this process of firewalking. Now, where do I get that? Did I get that out of the blue? No, we see this in Fire Walk with Me, right? The movie with Teresa Banks. The reason why Leland murdered Teresa Banks, Bob was trying to cover up his tracks. Teresa Banks was blackmailing him, okay? Well, here's someone else who can potentially point to Bob. And so he's using Leland to cover his tracks. Also, I mean, you kill this guy and you potentially have someone who could be the murderer you can't question anymore, even though they kind of believe him, what he has said to this point. But it also serves the purpose of taking suspicion off Leland Palmer as the murderer because you've showed him murdering someone, you know? And so it's really interesting. So we're starting to see an early manifestation of that concept of firewalking, okay? And that firewalking is something that happens in the third world and manifests itself. Pretty one chance out between two worlds, right? The third world and the first and second, world and so forth. Okay. My final point is about Agent Cooper. Agent Cooper, a lot of his story is told from his room. Okay, so the idea is when he goes into his room, something is happening, right? So he goes into his room, something's waiting for him. This happens to him several times. In fact, there was a time when someone knocked on his door and he cautiously went to the door. And then every time he goes in his room, something happens. This is a really good sort of red herring. It gets you thinking that when he goes into his room, something's going to happen. In this episode, he goes into the room and the phone rings. So it's satisfied that expectation that he's gone into his room and something's going to happen. So you don't expect something to happen at the door. So he's there, he's on the phone, he says, who is this? Which doesn't make sense because he should know who Andy is. But I think when they wrote it, they hadn't decided who it was going to be. And he hears a knock at the door, and you're satisfied that the thing that happens, because something happens whenever he goes to his room, has happened subconsciously. So when he opens the door, Josie Packard shoots him. Now, I have always hated the idea that Josie Packard shot Agent Cooper, and her excuse is terrible. Her excuse is because you came here. But if you dig a little deeper, it actually might make sense that Josie Packard tried to kill Agent Cooper, and here's why. To finish out the story of Ben Horne turning on Catherine Martell, he sends, and I may have mentioned this earlier, that Leo Johnson is going to attempt to kill, burn down the mill. And then what do we see? Hank Jennings says, I'm going to black flag this little firebug, which means he's going to kill Leo Johnson. So, Ben has turned also on Leo. So he's tying up all his loose ends. And I'm sure he could find a way to get rid of Hank too. But Hank and Josie are they have connections to this crime world. And it does make a little bit of sense that perhaps she would actually want to kill Cooper. In fact, a couple episodes previous, maybe just one, Cooper's I think it's Cooper, it could be Audrey, is walking into the hall of Great Northern, and he looks and he sees an Asian man walking into a room. And at the time you don't realize it, but in season 2 you figure out it's a different Asian man, but you figure out it's probably someone from Seattle that's part of this crime syndicate. It doesn't make sense, but it's given attention. Why? Well, you find out more in season 2. So clearly now here's what I'm saying. If this guy was at the hotel though, it could be that Josie said, hey, to the crime syndicate, there's an FBI guy here. There's an FBI guy here, and he could be a problem. He's staying at the Great Northern, and they were keeping an eye on him. So as I reinvestigated this, it started to make a little more sense why Josie Packard would want to kill Cooper. And they should have, I don't know if that was the idea they really had, though, because she said, because you came here. Well, maybe. It might have been better if she just said, maybe it was just poor writing. Maybe she should have said, I don't know, why would she want to tell him everything that they were really doing? Anyway, and we know what happened to Josie. She goes into the wood. Yikes. That was Lynch's idea, by the way. Rough. Interesting in theory, but execution was not there. Anyway, still the best single season of anything television I've ever seen. Really, really good. And that includes a laundry list of great TV shows that I've seen. Hope if you're someone who likes Twin Peaks and happened across this, that this was enjoyable for you. I hope I did give you some insights maybe you haven't seen before. After watching this for years and years and years, I thought it was a good idea to kind of put my thoughts on video. And have a good one.